Do you have patterns you see where you're like, these are some of the leading causes of disharmony in the soul in our culture, where you're really seeing like, because I know you deal with a lot of homeschoolers. Like these are people who are taking their jobs seriously as the parent educators of their children. They're trying really hard. And so it's, I just feel like I want to invite you to insult all of us and our kids too. But at the same time, I'm thinking like, I still have 3 kids at home. There's hope for them. I think.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling, who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can find me over at the Charlotte Mason Think Tank. Go to afterthoughtsblog.net/think tank to learn more. My co-host today is Misty Winkler. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 1 graduate. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, Gospel Encouragement for Keeping Your Sanity While Living and Learning Alongside Your Kids, now available on Amazon. It's not too late to join the Excellent Marksmanship seminar going on now in the Sistership. Excellent Marksmanship is all about marks with an X, and how he has made his marks, pun intended, on the world around us. So join us as we read Plutarch, the Communist Manifesto, and more. Just go to scholesisters.com/marks. Our special guest today is the one and only Gregory Wilbur. Greg is founder and president of New College Franklin, a Christian college that concentrates on the classics and the 7 liberal arts with a discussion-based approach and spiritual formation. In addition to teaching and developing curriculum, his current academic focus is advancing the disciplines of the Quadrivium by bringing together leading voices in its renewal. An award-winning musician, Greg has released 7 albums of his compositions of congregational psalms, hymns, and service music, as well as theatrical musicals and film scores, and his hymns can be found in more than 10 hymnals. Having taught for almost 30 years, he is a frequent speaker on music, the Quadrivium, arts, liturgy, and worship, and serves as chief musician and liturgist at Cornerstone Presbyterian Church in Franklin, Tennessee. Greg, his wife Sophia, and daughter Eleanor enjoy travel, reading, cooking, taking walks, and life in Middle Tennessee. In today's episode, Misty and I interrogate Greg about music. In the liberal arts tradition, music appears twice, once as a sort of poetic mode of knowing, and later as a liberal art that looks suspiciously like math. We want to know where instruments come in. And so, without further ado, let's get to it.
Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Misty, you want to give us an example of how this ought to be done?
All right. Well, my book that I'm currently reading is Marxism by Thomas Sowell.
Oh.
So I have a Marxism category this year for my 5x5 challenge. And I'm also preparing for the mentorship that we're going to be doing inside Sistership, which Brandy has aptly named Excellent Marksmanship. So, and so I found this title on Audible. It must have been related to something else I was looking at. And it's only 7 hours just on Marxism by Thomas Sowell. So I'm like, okay, reliable author. This will be great. This will fit into my category. It won't take forever and a day, but it's dense. So I'm just in chapter 2, listening to it. He's talking about how influenced Marx and Engels both were by Hegel, and how they use terms that are kind of uniquely defined in Hegelian philosophy. And so how the vocabulary is kind of working out in their thought. So like, whew, I need to brush up on my modern philosophy.
I'm just thinking, I don't know much about him.
Hegel redefines dialectic from like Aristotelian or classical. Dialectic is, logic. It's reasoning back and forth. But in Hegelian philosophy, I guess it's more the meaning is found in contradiction or through, there's not absolute truth. There's just development and process. And so you need contradiction and one thing being against another. And that's how meaning is made. I don't know. This is my kind of understanding so far. And maybe Greg can correct me if I'm wrong there.
Do you know Hegel?
Yeah, well, no, that's well put. I think the general language used with that is the idea of a thesis, and then the antithesis of that. So it's that contradiction, and then out of the thesis and the antithesis comes a synthesis. So it's the those things kind of combining together into a new understanding.
Right. Because they don't believe that there's actually an absolute truth, right? It's kind of all just happening.
Right. Yeah. And then that synthesis then becomes a thesis, which has an antithesis, which becomes a new synthesis.
Oh, so there's no end to the process.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, that's simplified to some degree, but that's the general idea of that for sure.
I've heard some of that. I'm not sure where. Maybe Francis Schaeffer. Something sounds vaguely familiar. It's ringing around in my brain. Anyway, I don't even know Sol wrote a book on Marxism. So that would make sense because wasn't he a Marxist at one point?
I couldn't tell you.
I feel like I heard an interview with him maybe on Uncommon Knowledge or something. And he explains that he was at one point. I'll have to look that up. Maybe you can link it later.
There you go.
So, Greg, what about you? What do you got for us today?
So I am reading and listening to a book called The Jazz of Physics by Stefan Alexander. And I'm about maybe a third of the way through. And the subtitle is The Secret Link Between Music and the Structure of the Universe.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
And so he's a musician and a physicist. And he forms a link between the idea of kind of improvisation and analogy and how understanding one area and applying that to an area in which you don't have understanding, making analogies between the two that can expand your understanding of that thing. So specifically for him with regards to his love of Einstein and his love of John Coltrane and
wow
aspect of jazz. And so then how that applies then to not only advancements in physics, but also our understanding of cosmic harmony.
This sounds like bringing the music of the spheres into the 21st century.
Yes. And interesting too, because with the music background, he's actually coming more from the scientific perspective, but he's allowing his love of music and his playing of jazz to influence that into that understanding from the scientific point of view.
I might need to get this book. This sounds fascinating. How interesting. Well, I feel like you guys have these really wonderful books.
What do you have, Brandon?
I've been making another foray into Terry Pratchett's Discworld.
Oh, fun.
It is fun. I have to tell you, I keep trying to decide, do I like this? Do I not like this? Is this just weird? I decide I've read, little bits and pieces here and there and decided I'm going to go back to the very first one, which I've never read, and maybe bring some order to the chaos that has been my reading in that series. And so I'm reading, what's it called? The Color of a Magic, which is the very first one, where it goes into quite a discussion of this, flat Earth and being on the back of a turtle that's standing on elephants or vice versa. Anyway, it is something. That's what I will say about that. I don't have any profound quotes because the whole thing is just bizarre. His mind is interesting. What keeps me coming back is that he has these moments where he's absolutely hilarious and he's making fun of something in our world. And so I could get a kick out of that. But wow, there had to be drugs involved at some point. That's all I can say. But it's been a nice break from my more serious reading. So anyway.
Hi, Abby here to tell you about the sistership. Homeschooling is important work, but it can feel overwhelming, wear us out, and take up so much of our time. Though it is hard work, it is good work. We all need real encouragement, supportive and truthful words, and discussions that engage our minds. Burnout is real. Discouragement happens in every homeschool. Our goal is to help moms combat burnout with Skole. Sistership is the place for classical Christian homeschoolers to connect locally and online. We exist to help homeschool moms overcome exhaustion and confusion with refreshing, sound, and invigorating learning. We want to equip moms to connect with local and online community and help connect with big ideas that apply to homeschooling that are broad and liberal in scope. We strive to provide smart and stimulating content for the classical homeschooling mom. We won't waste anyone's time. Join today at skolesisters.com/sistership for free.
Okay. Shall we transition to our topical discussion?
Sounds good.
Great.
All right. Today, I feel like I should call you Mr. Wilbur, because
Not at all.
that is what my son calls you all the time. And so in my head, that is your name. But we invited you here today because we wanted to talk about music, and who better to talk about music with than you, because you are known as a musician and a composer, but then also as someone who very much knows their stuff about classical philosophy and classical education and all of that. And we really have been trying to put some pieces together just because, growing up, music was sound related. Go figure. And there were things like instruments, and even the voice was an instrument. And so then you start getting into classical education and reading about classical education and classical philosophy and this kind of thing. And it just takes on this whole life of its own. For example, in the liberal arts tradition, and I don't know if you've read that book.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I figured you would have. They actually have music, not even as a liberal. I mean, it is later also a liberal art, but I mean, they have it as it's what I would call really poetic knowledge, where it's just this idea of like this pre-cognitive, synthetic kind of understanding of the world that's kind of happening before you hit the liberal arts. And then in the liberal arts, they have music, but it's very, very mathy. Like it almost made me feel like I couldn't ever know music because I wasn't smart enough in math. And at this point, I'm in my 40s and there's no hope for me. I don't think that's actually true, but it kind of felt that way at the time. But so then I find myself as I'm reading these things, and all of that's really interesting. But I'm like, where does sound fit into this? Where does what we all colloquially call music fit in to the scheme? So that's kind of like what we want to dance around today. So I thought first we would just start with the basic question of why are those other things that aren't what we typically would call music called music in classical education circles?
Great question. Yes. So here's part of the picture of that. Because we've lost the sense of what music truly is in the division of what it means in the early education and what it means in the Quadrivium. Well, because we've lost the Quadrivium, that we don't have those kind of categories, and so all of that has been meshed into one particular channel of understanding of music, and that's what's taught. I mean, I have 2 degrees in music, and so that's what we were taught. And this is, we see kind of this sense of development of music and leading towards instrumental music and the symphony. And this is what's important. And we've identified this period of time of music that's important to know from a cultural awareness kind of perspective. And that's what's taught, and that's what's perpetuated. And what hasn't come to the fore, at least until a little bit more recently, is what we've lost with regards to what is music and what is it for, and how has various philosophies and cultural movements changed our expectation of what that is and what we value and how we value those things. To give you a little bit of perspective on that, most of what is typically studied in music appreciation is music of the last 250 years. And it's almost entirely instrumental concert music. for a secular stage. Not a church setting, not a some other event setting, but for concert presentation.
Yeah.
And so it's an aesthetic of a concert, and it's typically exclusively instrumental. There's a couple thousand years of music prior to that we know of that we kind of gloss over, and part of that is the value of what we put on things with regards to pre and post Enlightenment understanding of what's significant, and what we've lost with regards to what music is and what its purpose is. I know that sounds a little vague, and I can get more specific on those things in particular, but is there something in there we want to zero in on first, or should I keep going?
Well, I do have one. I mean, this is like a little question. I think just growing up, I always assumed that we studied those specific eras of music and those specific pieces because we didn't have anything else that was older. I really think I thought that, I mean, not that I ever thought there wasn't music past that, but that maybe it had been lost or something. So is there actually a lot of music older than, say, 300 years old that we could, I shouldn't say a lot, but I mean, like we could hypothetically access those things?
Yes. But once again, the purpose is different too. I mean, we're talking much more vocal music.
Right.
And we're also talking much more liturgical music. And so there's a different focus then, and a different emphasis. And so when the value has been put on instrumental music for various reasons and separated from the church, then yes, this body of literature makes sense in terms of, from the Baroque period through classical period, Romantic period, etc. But what we fail to recognize then is what the difference is and what was going on before and why that was different. Bach being a very kind of pivotal person between the 1685, 1750, that transitions, by the time he was anachronistic in his own lifetime. So, those trends were moving around him. And so you see this interesting picture of what he was valuing in terms of what music was and where it was going in terms of the classical movement. And so there's different ideology there too. Like, for Bach, obviously there's that sense of music to the glory of God, but specifically related to how music itself reflects the order of the cosmos. That there's a physical, metaphysical relationship, that those things which are important spiritually also have a connection to those things which are physical. And with the Enlightenment comes that divide. We can rationally work through these things, on this level. Yes, there's this kind of divine sense of, deistic God or spiritual kind of thing, but there's not really a connecting point. Whereas for Bach and musicians prior to him, there would be much more of a sense of that music is not only reflecting the order of the cosmos, but also sustaining that order. That music is either creating harmony or creating discord. So there's a spiritual import there that pertained not necessarily just to what you heard, but also to the harmony of the soul and the harmony of relationships and of the community and culture. But then when you have the separation of we're writing music for the concert stage and the instrumental, well, and Hegel's a perfect example too. You've got with the classical period, you've got the advent of the sonato allegro form, which is the primary musical structural form that occurs in the development of the symphony, which happened during the classical era, which is a statement of a theme, a statement of a contrary theme, playing around with those, and then a restatement of both of those combined. So you have that thesis, antithesis, synthesis idea built into the musical ideas. And so it's a form that's actually conveying, Enlightenment thinking, philosophy in its very musical structure.
Was Hegel just putting words to something that was already going on in people's minds? That precedes him, right? Or do I have my timeline mixed up?
Well, there's a lot of those things in the air at the same time. So, there's and development of those ideas are happened over a period of time. So I think it's that same kind of idea. I don't have the date on him on my fingertips in terms of chronology there.
Right. Misty will tell you in about 5 seconds. I can hear the camera going.
I can Google that.
Some people.
But see, well, and moving on to like the Romantic period, Beethoven was a seminal figure between the classical and the Romantic period.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got the sense of the artist as prophet, as priest, and that they have a secret knowledge, and that they are have the significance as an artist and a bearer of truth to the masses. And there's this almost priesthood type role, which is which is why we built museums and concert halls, these temples, to this revelatory aspect of the artist. And so Beethoven is much more about Beethoven than he is about the cosmos. There's a great quote by Douglas Adams, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that says, I think it goes along the lines of Beethoven tells you what it means to be Beethoven. Mozart tells you what it means to be human, and Bach tells you what it means to be the cosmos.
Nice. Oh, that makes perfect sense to me, actually. Years ago, I read the Evening in the Palace of Reason.
Yeah.
Thank you. And he talked about that sort of like, I don't know if he used the word worldview, but kind of like this world, there was like this clashing of worlds between Bach and Friedrich.
Yes.
Anyway, this is just so interesting. I didn't expect to get into this, but I feel like now we need a history lesson because what was music, or what was the role of the musician before Bach?
Well, so I think there's two threads here. One is, you mentioned the idea of music in early education, and I think the liberal arts tradition does a great job of talking about, it talks about study of gymnastics and the study of music. And really, gymnastics as the training of the body, music as the training of the affections, or aesthetic training. But the idea there too is it's education in the muses. And so, the 9 muses, you've got epic poetry and history and comedy, tragedy, dance, astronomy, those enculturating elements. And of course, the 9 muses are the daughter of memory. Mm-hmm. And so, that education in the muses is the enculturation of, or the passing along the story of, who are we? How do we fit in? What's our foundation? Where do we come from? What are these things that we hold in common? Much like we do in families that, growing up, I think we had the same menu for Thanksgiving every year, right? It's part of our family liturgy that this is our story. This is who we are. And you pass those stories down. So, you enculturate the child in the story of the muses, which of course where we get, museum and that idea of the history of who we are. And that grounds them. And then from there, you would move into trivium, quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts, and flesh that out. But you've given them this love of music, of story, of poetry, of the stars and the story of the stars and the constellations. Because, astronomy is the same thing. That astronomy shows up as one of the muses, but it also shows up as part of the quadrivium. Mm-hmm. So somewhat the nomenclature is a little confusing because we call those things the same thing. Which is one of the reasons, like at New College in the teaching of the quadrivium, we've named it harmonia instead of music in terms of the quadrivium, because there's so much more that encompasses, that encapsulates. And that goes back to my next thread, which is Boethius. In his book on music in the 6th century, he identifies 3 aspects of what music is. There's the aspect of which is what becomes called music of the world, or music of the spheres, which it becomes to be called musical instrumentalis, or instrumental music, and musica humana, music of the soul. And those 3 aspects are basically, you've got the instrumental music is the heard music, but it's an ethical quality. I think Catherine Pickstock talks about this in one of her essays on Boethius. So there's the relational aspect of what is harmony in our relationships, in our families, in our culture, in our cities, our communities. The music of the soul is the interior life. I think what Scripture talks about with regards to unite my heart, to fear your name, or what does it mean to be pure-hearted, that you're of one mind. And that has everything to do with what's your daily schedule? How much sleep are you getting? How's your health? What's the balance of how you're doing holistically in terms of all those areas of life. And one of the beautiful things about harmony too, and I used the word balance, which I'm sorry I did so, because balance is much more a Greek idea. That you've got this thing over here and this thing over here, and what's the happy medium? That you have a little bit of this, a little bit of this. One example that I use with students is like if you're trying to balance out the idea of a God who is just and a God who is merciful. It's not that you want less justice and less mercy, because that negates who that God would be. But what does it mean to hold those things in tension, which is harmony? That it's fully just and fully merciful, but held together in a way in which both of those things make sense. And one of the beautiful things about harmony in music is there's so many instruments that create sound out of tension. You're putting tension to a string and plucking it, or bowing it, or to the head of a drum, or a harp. There's this tension that's there that then creates something that's harmonious, that's beautiful. And so it's not just the sense of balance, but that idea of holding those things in tension in a harmonious way. And then the cosmic harmony would be the third one, which is the greater aspect of the universe and the cosmological elements. And so what we generally concentrated on is the idea of musica instrumentalis, but as heard music. And in some ways, the philosophers and the medievals would have considered that the least of the three, in that you can train someone to play an instrument, but it's a far deeper thing to train someone or to equip someone or to cultivate someone to be harmonious in themselves. I think we see that even in terms of musical performance we've probably all been to a recital in which we've heard a young piano player play something note perfect that has no music to it.
Yes. So true.
And so
pretty sure I did that as a child.
Yeah, guilty, right?
Totally.
So there's that aspect of the heard music, but it's not really music. It's not really the soul of that, or what it means to play that in a musical way. So things become our emphasis to the neglect of the idea of what type of person plays harmoniously, and what does it mean then in the greater import of music as a sustainer of a greater order.
Wow. This is even bigger than I thought. I find myself wondering, because, most of our listeners, they're homeschool moms. They're at home with a bunch of little kids. So the example you gave, for example, of the child playing note perfect, but with no music. Is that the kind of thing that we all just grow out of? Or is that the kind of thing that the parent should try to address in some way?
That's a great question. And I realized too, this is a big thing. This is a big topic.
Yeah.
It's cosmic.
Literally.
And so I realize that, and in some ways that can feel really weighty. In conversations I've had with homeschool families over the years, there's a lot of concern of am I doing the right thing with music? Because that's not something I really grew up with. And I want to, I don't have as much background there. And we don't have as much guidance there. And so not to downplay or to discourage anyone in what they're doing, because anything in terms of music education, in terms of exposure to music, is a step towards something that is beautiful and in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And so all of those things have value in one way or another. But I think with regards to the specifics of your question, it's something that depends on the age and maturity. Yeah, you will hopefully grow out of those things. Some people won't ever, but part of it is also not necessarily that you do things differently, but that you have a different understanding of why you're doing those things. Hmm. And so it's not just here's a piece of music and here are the notes, but which notes are more significant than other notes and why? Where is this musical line leading? Where is the place of rest in the music? What does it mean to slow down a little bit for this into this line, this cadence, where this melody is going before moving into the next part, so that you're breathing that aspect of life into what the music is communicating, and not just the notes are the only thing. An analogy that I've kind of been trying to develop here in the last couple of weeks is, like with regards to Lord of the Rings. you can approach Lord of the Rings for the first time by looking at his map and reading through his map and seeing the various countries and the various, land features. And that is an aspect of the story. The story is dependent upon, those geographical regions and what people are next to other people and the climate. You can read Tolkien's histories and get all the backstory and why all those things are the way they are. Or you can read the story, which incorporates those things, is based upon, the story unfolds from a specific geography. It unfolds because of a specific history, and those things add a richness to it. But you can also just approach that without those deep studies in those other areas. All three of those things are part of the story, are part of the overall picture of Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings. But none of those really in and of themselves are complete. The story itself is probably the closest because it naturally incorporates aspects of geography and the history, or what you need to know about the history. But you don't get necessarily the significance to the overall aspect of the history of Middle-earth. And so I think music sometimes feels that way, I think, because we know there's music history, and that's important. And there's music appreciation, and that's important. And there's learning music and playing music, and that's important. And then there's music theory, and that's important. And so there's this sense of how do we even approach this? What do we give emphasis to? How do we spin all those things at the same time? And that can make it really overwhelming, especially in the midst of everything else that we want to give our children and everything, how all is interweaved together. Yeah, I think part of it is just recognizing that's the case. And then finding ways in which you can approach those things and what makes sense. And that's part of the idea of it's a lot easier to teach someone aspects of music theory if they already love music.
Yeah.
If they've been exposed to and love the idea of what song is, and then wanting to know why. I mean, I'm sure there are differences, but typically you teach a child to read by reading to them. That's the first step. They love story, and then eventually you teach letters, then you teach words. But there's already that love of, I want to know what the words are on the page. I know what a word is on the page because I've seen it go by as mom or dad reads it. But there's an entry point in which you develop a love of that, and then the desire to be able to do that, and a love of Bible or on your own comes from that and develops from that.
That makes a lot of sense. I used to do reading tutoring for kind of mid-elementary, where kids, it hadn't all come together for them. And so I would take them and, I'm working through phonics with them. And it really wasn't until I realized, nobody's reading aloud to these kids. They don't really have a desire to read. They don't think there's anything interesting to find out. When I started incorporating, 15 minutes of reading aloud into their tutoring sessions, it was that was when those kids started taking off.
Right.
And I really think it's because they found out that maybe there would be something in a book they wanted to know at some point, or that they would enjoy reading. But that's interesting to think about things like reading music or the theory as needing to be preceded by that love and interest.
Well, I love the way you put that in terms of it come together. Because I remember when I first started to try to teach my daughter music, I did the typical path. Here's the books, here are the piano books, and there's the theory book that goes along with it, and here's the note values. And I mean, you suddenly hit a child with, there are notes, there are lines, there are spaces, there are note values, there are what you see on the page translates to this idea that's in front of you on the keyboard or an instrument, and it's this foreign language. And I realized that, to explain one thing, I had to refer to something else, which was something that we hadn't talked about yet. But to talk about that meant that I needed to refer to something else. And so all those things are interrelated until they actually come together. And I think, there's so many aspects of knowledge like that, right? That you put those pieces there, and then at some point in time, once enough pieces are there, then the child begins to see those connections, and then it becomes, you move from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional, these various things. And it's one of the things I've told students for years too. It's about the junior year of high school or college, and in fact, second or third year in both of those areas. in which suddenly things begin to really click.
Mm.
But it takes a couple of years of like laying those pieces there, and then they do come together. There's those periods that seem to be a little dry and they're drought-like because they're not really landing, and then all of a sudden things just like sprout. But I think it helps though too that you're not just dealing with one area, but you're allowing those other things to come and play. Is there music in the home as well? Are you talking about what you're listening to? Is there discussion of what it means to listen? Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't always necessarily have to be all formal, obviously, instruction, but then those things are there, those other pieces are there. So when they do come together, there's all these other things coming from various points and coalesce.
Is the skill of being able to read music, which I do think is a little bit separate from theory. I managed to flunk out of theory for kind of a long time. I could read music, but I couldn't really articulate what I was seeing. Actually, I have one child. He just decided to stop doing theory until his mom found out like a year later. Anyway. He is not the one you know well. Is that skill, is it super important or is it optional? It's kind of like the whole phonics, whole word thing. I find I'm finding these competing worlds out there where some people are just like, a kid can just learn an instrument and be a musician, and it doesn't matter that they can't read music. And I don't want to say that's absolutely not true, but I mean, is it important to read music?
I think so, for a number of reasons. I mean, I know there are people who make their living. I mean, I live in Nashville. There are people who make their living in music who don't read music.
Right.
Yeah. I'll stop there. I mean, there is a different intuitive sense, and there are musicians who just have that. But for the most part, that's a gift and beyond. One of the things that Martin Luther talked about with regards to Scripture was that he wanted people to be able to read, so that they could read books and they could read the Bible and they could read other texts. But he also wanted instruction in singing, so that people would know how to sing. Mm. And that was an important part of knowledge as well. And so it's not just the technique of singing, but being able to read the notes on the page. There is something I think we've lost something when a lot of singing is done with just words in front of us and not actually seeing the notes, that we've lost the ability for other people to sing parts. And And part of that, you can intuit some of that, and even if you can't read the notes directly, you can at least see when it goes up and down, and you can get much more familiar with that as well. But if you're already generally familiar with music, it's not too much of a stretch more to actually be able to read it, or to be able to read your voice part, or to be able to have that as a skill. That changes how then you understand music. And the other thing too, that there's Chesterton talks about the fact that we kind of bow to the expert, that we do fewer and fewer things and let other people do them for us because they do them better than we do. And he says, eventually we'll pay someone to laugh because they laugh best. And there's something about even being a part of a musical ensemble that's not making great, beautiful music. There's something about being inside music that is of immense value, which then hopefully will lead to better performances and better understanding of the music. But there's something about being inside of it that makes a difference. When I started composing as a teenager, I basically composed on the piano, and I would work things out by playing without writing things down. And so I was limited, one, by what I could remember, and two, by what I was physically able to play, because I couldn't write something that I couldn't play because it was dependent upon me playing it. And so when I shifted to composing on the page, it made such an immense difference, because then I was able to go beyond what my own playing abilities were, and also what my memory, and to be able to then see that develop as particular ideas. One of the beautiful things about well-crafted music, Renaissance period, early Baroque, there's this the dialogical aspect of one voice talking to another voice, or one instrument talking to another instrument, and to see those things on the page and to recognize what's going on there that's developed through the writing of that. You miss that if you're only dependent upon your own abilities to do that with your own memory.
That's interesting. I was thinking about how I at least find being able to read music. I mean, I read it okay. I'm not you, but that I found it, I don't know if freeing is exactly the right word, but like it gives me a measure of independence, I guess. Kind of like the way being literate helps you be independent, right? Like you can read the book for yourself. You don't have to depend on someone giving you the right synopsis of the book or something. I was thinking about the difference. Misty and I and Abby, our other co-host who's not here today, we travel around and have a retreat once a year, and we'll go visit a church. And, visiting a church that has the music, like has a hymnal or something that we can read, means that we can just jump into the song we don't know because the music will tell us. Versus if I'm at a church that has only chord charts or just words, even worse, I have to wait, and I can't actually participate because by the time I'm starting to get the song, it's basically over. I mean, part of that's because we haven't really visited a church that repeats itself a lot. Mainly because Misty won't let us. But you know what I'm saying.
Yes, right.
Being like, it gives me immediate access to it. And it's also very corrective because there was this one church in Arizona that we visited that had the lyrics were the same as the song that we sang at our church. But the melody, apparently denominations have their own melodies. I wasn't aware of this. I was in California. Anything goes, right? So it was only the music on the page that kept me from completely hanging myself out to dry in front of everybody.
Right. Well, and then if you're a guy, if you're a bass, and there's no written part, and you don't have the range to sing the melody, you're kind of stuck without being able to sing. You've cut somebody off from being able to participate in what's supposed to be a corporate experience. And so even that idea too of if it's all improv, then you can try to find your place in that. But if it's written out, then there's a space for everybody.
Yeah.
And that they can bring their gifts, and the total is greater than the sum of the parts, and that there's a place for everyone to fit in. That is a beautiful expression then of what's happening musically. Because once again, music is supposed to be harmonious, and if by your music, by how you're going about that, you're creating a disconnect or excluding, then you're not embracing fully what it means to bring concord, to bring shalom, to bring peace, the rightness of what things should be.
Okay, can I ask you a question that wasn't on our list?
No, sure. Yeah, I think I've gone way around the block anyway, so sorry.
Never apologize for this. As the president of a college, you encounter lots of college students in your job. This is kind of a tricky thing, but I'm sure that you see, shall we say, patterns of disharmony or inharmoniousness or whatever the word would be. Do you have patterns you see where you're like, these are some of the leading causes of disharmony in the soul in our culture, where you're really seeing like, because I know you deal with a lot of homeschoolers. Like these are people who are taking their jobs seriously as the parent educators of their children. They're trying really hard. And so it's, I just like, I want to invite you to insult all of us and send our kids to you. But at the same time, I'm thinking like, I still have 3 kids at home. There's hope for them. I think. So I'm just wondering, like, are there things where you're saying these are areas where really it would be good for us to stand up and take notice?
Yeah. Right. Well, and I'm a homeschool dad too. And my daughter's a senior this year. So been through that journey as well over the last 12 years. I know this sounds kind of obvious. Technology is part of that too. I think there's a disconnect that happens when people pull out their phones there's a disconnect too between, we used to say, hey, I wonder what something is, and not necessarily know because we couldn't look it up in the moment. But now even our way conversation is directed or communication takes a difference because of how we then incorporate technology into our conversation. I mean, obviously things like text communications are very effective and helpful, but at the same time, you're also continuing to perpetuate that small attention span, and that you're not allowing for longer discourse. So obviously there's technological aspects of things that show up in so many ways. I think being able to appreciate silence is one as well. One, we live in a noisy world in so many different ways, not just audible noise, but just, in terms of beliefs and, politics and culture and so forth. There's just a lot going on there. So what does it mean to be able to appreciate silence and to be okay with your own thoughts, especially in a spiritual way, to meditate on scripture or to pray or to sort through things and not just distract oneself one way or the other. I think that's a great discipline that, kind of pays attention to how you're processing things and how you're thinking about things and what are the things that are causing stress or distraction. That's something that we don't cultivate necessarily as well as we should overall. And I'm guilty of that. So that I'm pointing my finger at me too on all those. So those are things that also kind of give a groundedness then to somebody and how they interact with other folks. I think too, there's a difference between resolving conflict within a family and resolving conflict with somebody not from your family. And I think paying attention to that as well, is that when those things arise, with friend groups or other families or adults, etc., that there's attention paid to how those things play out. Especially when, talking from a college perspective, you do wind up having students, maybe this be their first time really away from home. And so, encountering what does it mean to have a roommate that's not your sibling? And what do you do with, when the house rules that you grew up with are not the same house rules that they grew up with, and they leave dirty dishes and you don't, or vice versa, or, how do you actually talk about those things? And how do you come to resolution? And those are things that, like I said, are different. Those things are regulated differently within the home than when you leave the home. And just being aware that that's coming in one way or another.
Just probably practice for your first year of marriage as well.
Yeah. Well,
third and the fourth.
Well, that's a beautiful example too. I mean, obviously that give and take, of course, that's why the beautiful imagery of dance and cosmic dance and shows up as well musically and cosmologically of the give and take of what it means to dance together. And the true sense of dance, not the modern sense of dance.
Right. This is very timely. We've had quite the neighborhood drama lately, so caused by the child that avoided music theory. Is there a connection?
Well, and this is a kind of a whole other. I hesitate to even bring this up but anyway, this is so cool. This thing, some things that my wife and I have been reading and talking through. Even the ways in which physiologically we inhabit the things that we know. That memory is stored not just in our consciousness, but also even in our bones and muscle. There's the difference between looking up a fact and actually memorizing it, because memorizing it makes it physiologically a part of you, especially with those things which are good and true and honorable and beautiful, that then become a part of who we are and add an aspect of harmoniousness to our very being. And not just that we know the right things, but we're becoming that person.
In homeschooling, there's a lot of music lessons, right? People, especially piano, but even beyond that, you'll see people doing violin or guitar or whatever. I don't know, something about this idea of harmony between persons makes me wonder if and I've often thought this actually, that like if maybe one of the great weaknesses of homeschooling, which can be remedied, we just have to be deliberate, is the lack of group music, choral or orchestra or band. I can get my kids piano lesson, but especially post-COVID, it's super hard to find them a choir. Like, that's just not a thing right now. Do you think that, I mean, I don't know, I hate to be like, we should add more things to our lives, but but I'm wondering, like, if I was going to, hypothetically, if I was going to add something, would group music, group dance, group singing, like, would those kinds of things be, I don't know, like a move towards harmony, the kinds of things we're talking about?
Yes, I think so. And I think there's, we're blessed in our area with like a homeschool orchestra and homeschool choirs and things like that, that there are opportunities to do that, which, I certainly understand that's not the case everywhere. And especially in more,
tyrannical
remote areas.
Oh. Wrong word, sorry.
Less densely populated areas, but yes, categories, yes. Yeah, and so that's not necessarily as easy to do, but it doesn't have to be a choir of 30 or 40 or 70. You can have a small ensemble. You can also have, just a group of string players together, or a string player and a piano. But this, how you play piano when you're playing a piano solo versus how you play piano when you're accompanying someone is completely different, because there's this whole give and take, and there's that attention to the other person, and that's part of the fun of music, right? Music making, that there's a synergy and that comes from playing together. And so even like difference between playing piano solo, accompanying someone. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this huge ensemble. It could be, piano and a string and a guitar or whatever. But there's that give and take, and that, especially if you're trying to work things out, especially if it's an unusual ensemble. Like, okay, what part are you going to play? What are we going to do here? And figure those things out. And that's, once again, that's that kind of that epical, communal, instrumental aspect of harmony, and then the give and take that has. So obviously, the larger ensembles are helpful. But then even it doesn't have to be huge.
Even the sanctification that happens with a sibling piano duet.
Yes.
Like, oh wait, you don't have a beat.
Yeah. Well, and it's that aspect of too. I mean, what is your part in this? What part are you playing in this? And are you trying to take over? Or are you in submission, mutual submission, trying to create something together? And there's all sorts of beautiful lessons in that. I remember the first time, I played in marching band all through like junior high and high school. And then when I got to college, I wound up in an orchestra for the first time. And just the difference of sitting there on the stage and hearing the sound of the strings sweep around me. It's like, this is a whole different experience. And seeing music from that perspective and being a part of that ensemble in that way. I remember the moment, because it's so radically changed. You are opened up this whole new aspect of what music is and what it means to participate in it together.
I guess one of my questions coming into the conversation, especially with how the liberal arts tradition stretches that category of music beyond music appreciation or learning an instrument, is learning an instrument a part of classical education? Or is it just a valuable addition but not essential to education?
Oh, great question. I would say that learning and participating in music is essential. So if that means through means of an instrument or through means of voice or both, or however, that should be as much as possible a component. It's not necessarily that, you fit into some sort of level of classical education because you play this particular instrument. But the fact that you understand what it means to participate in and understand music in that way, I think is important, definitely.
Yeah, that's kind of something you can't really understand conceptually without doing in some kind of way.
Right. I think too, even from the standpoint of talking about music, it's so instructive to have, even if it's a picture of a piano keyboard in front of you, or an actual piano, just so that you can see as well. But that's not, that's helpful, but not the same also as making music or playing an instrument or learning that discipline as well. Yeah, as you mentioned, there's a stretch there of all that encompasses, but still that. So I think the heard music is the doorway. That's in the hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. That's the entryway that brings us into the beauty of what music is and can be, and then leads into the opportunity for that broader perspective. Part of losing our categories is it's there, but that we don't necessarily identify it as such. When your car is not running well, you go for tune-up. That's a musical word. You're retuning your car so that it runs harmoniously. If you're sick, something is out of balance, and so you're rebalancing, retuning what it means for the body to be well. You talk about the idea that you resonate with an idea, or you resonate with a concept. That's a musical term. We have these vestiges of musical terms and the idea of harmony, but we've separated those as different categories and are not making a stronger connection of the things that we're already talking about. That this is a broader understanding of harmony in a fuller sense. Yeah, it has all the math, but it has all the aspects of physics and the connection between geometry and astronomy. That whole thing that can be explored. But it's there in so many other ways, that it's not just the notes on the page or not just music theory, but what it means to live harmoniously within our own heart, within our own life, within our community, within our relationships, and then what effect that has cosmologically of bringing harmony instead of discord. I mean, there's so many references that the Apostle Paul uses in his letters about live in harmony with one another, live at peace with one another, and it's once again that musical image of living in concord and taking that to a not just as that's a quaint idea, but there's something really rich there and something really deep there that connects the other things that we're already doing, but just being more aware of how we can make those connections.
Okay, final question. Do you have any recommendations for parents who still have children at home? It's kind of a broad question. So whatever you want to say. So
Usually feed them. Yeah. Send them to bed. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Just don't make me give up my rock music and we're okay.
Well, see, there's that. See, that's a whole other conversation. But, I mean, I think part of that is what does it mean to listen with understanding, and like I said, there's another conversation of understanding those categories. I think as much as possible, have a musical home and be intentional about that. And I know there's probably people who don't have a music background and don't know where to start, but there are playlists, or there's some suggestions, or find a musical tie-in with something that you're studying in literature or in history that just connects in some way. There's an opportunity to make that a part of what's going on, and not always background music. There's a place for that, but there's also the significance of listening actively to music. I think we sometimes get off along the path of the idea of listen to this music. What does it make you think of? Draw a picture of that idea, as opposed to what is the music itself? How can we identify what a beautiful melody is, or what this melody is doing? You don't have to identify all the instruments, and that could be a beautiful folk song, and that could be a symphony, or that could be a Renaissance choral piece, or that could be the hymn that you sang at church last week, or it doesn't. Yeah. But you're paying attention. You're drawing attention to and paying attention to what music is and how it works. Because there's so many intuitive aspects too. We know when a melody feels incomplete because it hasn't come to rest. It hasn't brought us home. Those things which we recognize of how music works. Because music, the ratios, the numbers behind music are a reflection of the created cosmos, a reflection of order. And if those things are disordered, we feel those things as disordered. And when those things are ordered, there's a sense of completeness and of rightness. That's overly simplistic. but there's that sense of we intuitively know when things are the way they should be, or why this melody is complete and why this one isn't.
I love that. And that feels more accessible to me.
Good. Yeah. Because, last thing too, I mean, I know in terms of being, last thing I would want to do is burden people with more things to do. Or like, oh no, I have to do everything different and go down a different path. And
Right.
No, it's how can you do what you're doing, maybe think about it a little bit differently, or add to the conversation and not scrap what you're doing. Or what is one thing that we can add? It doesn't have to be this huge music program. There's all these riches. I mean, you're never going to be able to read everything you want to read. I was about to say I've come to my grips with mortality, and I haven't. I still rebel against that. I rebel against that every day. But you're not. And so, to not feel the weight of I'm not doing everything I could do. You don't need to live under that. But what are some things that are manageable that do enrich and to add to what you're already doing, and start there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and having this discussion with us. This was incredible. I don't know what I expected, but I didn't expect a history lesson. Very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. It's been so fun.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're following us in your favorite podcast player so you don't miss any of this season. We have plenty special planned just for you. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolesisters.com/SS102 to check it out. Don't forget to come join our reading and discussion about Karl Marx and the world around us inside the sistership. Sign up over at scolesisters.com/Marx. Once you're inside, go to seminars and look for the Excellent Marksmanship Seminar. That's where the party's going on. In our next episode, Pam, Misty, Abby, and I are discussing the oft-mentioned assertion that classical education, quote, makes you more human. What does this mean, and is it okay to say things like this? Tune in to find out. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
There we go.
Great.
I was trying to think, how can I help him?
There's snow on the ground here.
Oh, I'm trying to be happy for you guys with the snow, but really I'm like, why? Why would water freeze and land on the ground? I just don't know.
Can I give a quote from a book that I haven't finished yet? So I don't know exactly where it's going to go yet.
We do that all the time.
Sometimes I haven't even opened it. I'm just excited because it came in my mail.